There we go. Thank you for joining us here on Dying of Exposure, and welcome to Dying of Exposure, the series that gave this channel its name. My name is Steve, and I am here with performing artist and internet master, Lex the Lexicon artist, and she's joining me partially because she's got an album coming out, but partially just because she's a very interesting person. And the Dying of Exposure interview series is about interviewing creatives who have experienced a lot of life as an artist and have some things to inform us. So first off, how you doing, Lex?
I'm doing so well after you said all of that. I aspire to be called an internet master. I just want you to know that the fact that you called me an internet master means so much more than almost any of the other names anyone has ever called me. Because internet master, really? Oh, I feel like that's just it's the goal for like a younger millennial like me.
Yeah, it is. It is. I was just happy being a moderator back in the old days, so that's where I capped out. So let's talk about it. You have a new album coming out March 31st.
Correct.
And tell us about, because this is your second album, correct? Your second full length
Right.
album. So talk to us about it. What's it called? What's it about?
The album is called Alter Ego. What I like to call it is a spiritual, how should I put it? A spiritual sequel to Raging Ego. Now, a lot of people might think that it is a companion piece, which it is. In a lot of ways, it is a companion piece to my previous album. But it's not a parallel piece, it's a directional piece. Does that make sense? It's not sun and moon. It's heart gold, soul silver. No, it's gold and silver to heart gold, soul silver. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a directional companion piece, and so in a way, Alter Ego is representative of obviously me as the protagonist moving forward in my analysis of my own ego. So it's a directional journey, and specifically Alter Ego is about not only the alter egos that inhabit me and a lot of other people, and people in general, but also how I managed to go from a raging ego to less of a raging ego. I think that's probably the main narrative arc that goes through this album. It chronicles my life from approximately mid-2018 to early 2020, which is when I finished the album. And a lot of things have happened in these, in this 1.5 years. In fact, so much has happened. And all of that stuff has really made me into a different person. So, I like to think of albums as chronicles of my life. I've started writing journals again, but in one of my songs from Raging Ego, Curse of Creativity, I talk about how I used to write in diaries, but now I don't because I only write songs. And what I mean by that is all of my songs are kind of recordings of feelings and thoughts and events that I've had in my life. Mostly the songs in the albums are those. I made other kinds of songs as well, but the songs on the albums are chronicles of my life. So they're like an audio diary for me. So if you look at the way Alter Ego is structured, it does have a central narrative flow, and it takes you through the journey of me starting from where I was in Raging Ego with a really raging ego, still struggling with it, still braggadocious and still over the top, going through this process and cycle of becoming a more nuanced and compassionate and community-oriented person than I used to be. So I think that's probably the core of this album.
Yeah, it's a fantastic. So for me, it's such a. I'm glad you said directional companion piece, because it isn't really a call and response. It's not really opposite of Raging Ego per se.
Yeah.
It's just very different in an evolutionary way, but still like obviously directly attached. I love that. So I had heard so many versions of Party Hop because I know Cloth and Pop, and that means I heard it as like piece by piece, and then y'all did a nice little warm-up where you released drums and then drum and bass, and then kind of released pieces of songs deleted. And Party Hop is like almost a fake out tonally. Not tonally is the wrong word. Instrumentally, it's a fake out for the album, I feel, because it's very up and it's very high energy and it's very 90s in its kind of delivery. And the rest of the album, the energy's there vocally. Your delivery is still fast. It's got good patter. It's there's still energy in your voice, but like the mood of the musicality, it feels like not 100% of the tracks, but there's 16 tracks on it. And out of that, I'd say at least 14 tracks, I'd say, fit into like categories of like minor sad keys or like kind of dark turns and a little bit of not so much discordance, but like suspended seventh type harmonies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
A little bit more of a chill vibe. Can you talk about why did you do that on purpose? Did it all just sort of naturally come together? Was that the music you were feeling, or like how did that happen?
There's a couple of explanations to this. So let me go back to something you were saying earlier. You're saying that this doesn't feel, obviously it feels different, but it feels obviously very attached to Raging Ego. And that's kind of how I like to think about myself. You know, I'm an extremely different person from who I was in June 2018 when I released Raging Ego. And I'm also an extremely different person from not only that person, but also different people I have been throughout the years. However, the core tenets of myself have not changed. Now, I realized this when I read a diary entry that I wrote probably in like 2010. I have written stuff all my life, long form, short form, so I dug up a whole bunch of documents and I read a lot of journals and fan fiction and, you know, long form stories that I've written over the years, and I've mostly been talking about the same stuff. Like self-consciousness, you know, anxiety within like a romantic context, self-esteem, feeling like I'm not sure if I'll amount to anything, you know, worrying about my legacy, like all that stuff. And when I realized that like the core tenet of me has not changed, essentially, and I will always have those elements within me, and I will essentially never be able to get rid of them. And that's one of the themes of alter ego, which is it's hard to alter your ego. It's different. I mean, it's difficult. It's, you know, we can take steps to change ourselves, but at the end, a lot of times we kind of go back and forth, you know, from cycle to cycle, returning to the same points. And we can reach different conclusions, but it's not always that easy. So listening to this album is not always that easy, is how I wanted to structure it. You know, I don't want it necessarily to be a comfortable listen, but I want it to be a little bit hopeful. But there are some, you know, kind of points in the album where you realize that, like, oh, maybe this should have ended on a happier note, but it didn't. Well, that's just life, right? And yeah,
it speaks to me a lot as a person, as a person, as an artist, as a person just from Seattle, of not ending on a happy note. Do you feel like it's so funny too, because you move in between Raging Ego and Alter Ego, you moved coasts from San Francisco to New York. And it almost feels like you moved, like everything about it moved East Coast a bit more.
Oh, really? I want you to tell me more about that from how you analyzed it, but go ahead.
Yeah, it feels like you got, serious is the wrong word. More direct. There's still that good lexicon, you know, like rapid fire kind of hype, fast patter that comes from artists that we'll talk about influencing you in a bit here. And there's still like a lot of up. Your choruses are all very catchy. Your great hook work. And they nail it. There's of course the track that has what's his name? Like the fifth track on the album. If all of my devices weren't busy interviewing you, right? Atlas, yes, all the time is, I mean, you got the benefit of Atlas, right? But you're just constructing a very kind of catchy thing, and that's what's kind of joyful almost in its sadness and in its neuroses to me, is that there's all this catchiness, there's all these like flow schemes and tricks and stuff like that, there's all this nice like fast rap, and the energy in your voice doesn't drop. But
I would argue that it's actually gotten better. Like, I feel like my delivery has far improved from the last album. Like, when I listened back on it, I was like, this sounds way better. And I think one of the reasons is I've gone on 3 tours since I released the last album, and I've just gotten better vocally, like, delivery-wise. But as far as, like, the mood goes, you know, as you said, like, serious may not be the right word. It's direct, and I do think, going back to what you were talking about, Party Hop, that was like absolutely an intentional choice. Party Hop was written in 2017, which was a very different part of my life. That's why it sounds so different from the rest of the album. But it's also still a really strong song, and one of the goals that I had for this album was to write a lot more melodic, catchy hooks. Where that involves some singing, and that song is mostly singing, so this is the direction that I want to go into more, and you can kind of hear that in this album, although 2 songs only are like majority singing, but I do a lot more singing in this album. Essentially, I did want to find like kind of like a fake out track. I think the way that you described it is really great. I wanted to have the lead single be a song that I really fucking like. Like, I really like Party Hop. I think it's probably one of the best songs I've ever written, and it's one of the best produced ever, because Clop and Pop is a magician. And I just decided to drop that. But I also so that was written in a different time, so that's why tonally it can sound a little different from a lot of the other songs. But at the same time, it was also an intentional choice for me to choose that to be the single, because I wanted people to develop a wrong impression of the rest of the album. I wanted people to think like, oh my god, this is gonna be such a hype, like, party, positive album, and then they're hit with this like really dark cover art of Alter Ego. Like, I posted the cover art a couple weeks ago, and I just wanted people to be like, what? Like, this is gonna be interesting. Like, I think tonal shifts are also a really important part of this album, because Alter Ego, it isn't just about changing your ego, it's about all the different things in your head that, you know, can interact with your life and take on lives of their own. And so I wanted to represent that with a variety of crazy different sounds.
It's so good. And for the audience, there is on Dying of Exposure breakdown, Nerd Music and Judgment, where I go track by track on it and pretty much sing Lex's praises through the whole thing. It's ridiculous how many times I've listened to this album at this point, and I was so prepared for 16 tracks to be a little too long, especially when I saw that most of them lived 3 minutes plus, some of them into the 4 minutes. I was so prepared for that, but it really doesn't feel like it, and it's because you do a good job of just spreading out the pop functionality of each song, so that it doesn't feel like there's like a 4 or 5 track kind of middle, where there's songs that are important to you, but you know they're not going to be things that anyone in a concert or in a live performance would want. It feels like this whole 16 track album, it's like, yeah, mood-wise, they might not be high enough energy for every venue, but all of them could play at the right concert with the right bill happily, and most of them would play at any of them. It just means that you'd have to have the audience be willing to kind of journey with you. But I did want to talk about that journey. Let's start off with the kind of broader sense. Lex, you've been rapping and performing for 3 to 4 years now. Is that about?
Yeah, almost 4 at this point. Yeah, I would say it's, so my anniversary of being Lex is June 28th of 2016. And so that was the day I considered myself officially started. So we're almost at the 4-point mark.
Yeah, and beside being unreasonably talented for somebody who's only been doing it for such a short amount of time. And it's not luck, it's skill, it's talent, and it's effort. But let would you consider yourself like a nerdcore hip hop artist specifically? Or do you just consider yourself an indie hip hop artist? Or like you said, there's more singing on this. What would you categorize you as a performer?
I spent a lot of time thinking about my labels, and I'm realizing that it changes a lot. Right now, I'm going with I make cerebral pop rap, and what I mean by that is I make pop rap for nerdy people. And I think it really shows through my song construction or my beat choices in a lot of the music. It's very poppy, and it's very strictly structured, verse, chorus, and I try my best to make the choruses very catchy. So I would absolutely say that this veers more on the side of pop than alternative. I think this is less weird than I used to think it was. However, I think it's still too weird for the normal population. So I think people have some growing to do, you know, like they need to realize that like I make pop, and just because it sounds nerdy doesn't necessarily mean that like it's unable to crack the mainstream ceiling. So my belief is that I'm happy to be called a nerdcore artist, you know, and I don't necessarily think that I'm very strictly hip hop, if that makes sense. I think hip hop is a sound. Like, I'm a rapper, and I consider myself a rapper. And if you say that I'm a nerdcore rapper, I will accept that label. However, I think a lot of people make more specifically hip hop sounds that take after, you know, hip hop construction and hip hop ethos. And I find that while I do that sometimes, I don't do that all the time. Sometimes I'll craft a song that is purely pop. It isn't hip hop at all. Sometimes I'll craft a song that is like surf punk. So it can really vary. And going back to what I've always believed, I think if people call me nerdcore, I will happily accept that. But I've never believed that an artist who IDs as nerdcore should be unable to break into something that is, I think, that is less niche. Does that make sense to you? Yeah, like I think that there are so many people within our community, within our scene, so many artists who are incredibly talented and really deserve mainstream viability. And I have never understood why they have not gotten there yet. And I want to be one of those people who gets there. You know, I think that if people are able to access these musical artists, then they absolutely will like them because their talent and skill are undeniable. And I think that it is just a matter of access and exposure. People aren't, you know, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, I've never heard of this artist, but then I show them a song, they're like, wow, this is really good. They become like really big fans. So how do we find a way for nerdcore artists to access that level of high exposure, dying of exposure, as you might say, so that, you know, they can be discovered by a larger swath of people, as opposed to just a specific audience, which is not small, mind you. It's not a tiny audience. There's a consistent group of people who listen to nerdcore music. But I think people who don't specifically listen to the artists within this scene would also find appreciation in what I make. And that's why I don't, you know, specifically tout myself to only work within nerdcore. I will consider myself a nerdcore artist, but I have aspirations to, you know, expand beyond that specific niche audience into like a broader audience who likes, you know, weird pop rap for nerds.
It's so in that journey of being kind of a nerdcore artist, or kind of a weird fringe artist, who moving more toward kind of a like a pop structure. Not that anyone who goes and listens to any of your other releases, or almost all of your other releases, will hear sort of what you're talking about. Raging Ego has it all over the place, where you don't necessarily structure things or are limited by sort of the history of hip hop. But in that journey, you've mentioned that the last like year and a half to 2 years has been a massive shift. Now, I can only assume from Alter Ego that some of that is relationship based off of a number of the songs that you have, or romantically or interpersonally related. And then, so do you feel like when you're writing these albums about your personal kind of journey, when you're sort of diarying or journaling it out as a song to people, do you feel like you're either being more vulnerable, or do you feel like through song you're sort of armoring yourself against the emotions that you're having? Because I feel like a lot of these songs are deeply personal, do not always paint you in the most positive or necessarily emotionally healthy light all the time, which is honest. It's honest. You're not a bad person. I'm not saying you're a bad person, but you're not pretending to be. You're not acting as if you're a wholly complete or perfectly suited to deal with these emotions person through all of it. Do you feel like you're making yourself more vulnerable to your audience, or do you feel like you're making yourself less vulnerable to like the acts? Is it a shield, or is it like a pathway to emotion?
It's definitely the second one. I have no intention of being more vulnerable. In fact, if you listen to the final track, Retcon Artist, it's a contemplation on how I shouldn't have said any of that shit in the first place. And it, like, I constantly flip-flop between, oh my god, this is such a great thing to write about because I want to talk about this and I have no one else to talk to. And, oh my god, why did I talk about that shit? That's way too personal. None of you should be hearing this. So, that's a constant shift between these two. As far as, do I feel like, what was the other thing that you asked? Like, do I feel like I'm,
do you feel like this helps you, set the experiences sort of in a stone or in a historical place so that they're no longer impacting you, or do you feel, or so they're no longer upsetting? I only bring this up, I'm sort of dancing around it. You discuss things that sound like they're fairly traumatizing in the album. You do it in a fun way, but they sound like they've really aggressively impacted you emotionally. And so I know from my personal experience, and I'm projecting a little bit here, but I know from my personal experience that if I put something into a song or into a bit or into something, I then put it into a package. And now it's contained in that package. And that's how I address that thing mentally. Is that what you're doing? Or do you feel like this music helps you do that? Or is that just, or is it just, you have to get it out, it's part of the process, and it still kind of creeps up on you? Does the music help act as a wall to sort of move on from those things?
I don't think it acts as a wall at all, in fact. I think it's just self-therapy. Because by writing out these songs, it's an effort to work through some of these issues. Lately I have been considering getting professional help. But, I think that to the extent that I can do self-therapy, writing music is like probably my top way to do it. And, obviously I like writing fun songs, that, are catchy and are fun to be performed. And I think the performance part of it is the most therapeutic part, where I can get on stage, perform a song, and then have people connect to it. And I really enjoy myself in the process. So I guess in a way, I craft songs to be self-therapy because writing stuff out has always helped me. I don't necessarily think that it blocks things. I don't necessarily think that it solves problems for me, but it can often provide more of an insight to what I'm feeling. And it's a way that I process emotions, essentially. And it's the primary way. And I think that a lot of people, especially my fans, like listening to that because they hear what I'm going through and they can relate to it. And I think that I have continued to be this open and this direct and this honest because I know that that is something that helps them too. And that is something that when they hear themselves in my music, it really helps them and it really gets them to a better place. And so in a way, it's not only self-therapy. I like creating things that can make other people feel better. And that is a major goal for what I do as well.
Let's talk then about some of the events that occurred, if you will. And I'm going to touch on some kind of broader subjects, and then you
Sure.
can either elaborate or we can get to the point where you're like, nah, I don't really know about that. All right. So, you, from my perspective, being kind of connected to the nerdcore hip hop community, when you started releasing music early on, and started coming out into specifically nerdcore, and into the nerdcore Facebook group, and started kind of showing up and performing, you were pretty widely or pretty generally accepted. People were pretty excited about it, and everything. Do you feel so it was a fairly positive experience over the past, we're gonna say about a year, because I think it was about a year ago, maybe 7 months ago. You've had on and off interactions with different other artists, creatives, serious fans, trolls. Do you feel like your connection with other artists within like nerd music specifically, do you feel like that remains a positive thing, a negative thing? Is it the same for you as it was when you started kind of at the beginning? Has it evolved?
Yeah, you're asking some really good questions. I'm very excited to kind of dive into these. If you look at the song "The Real Thing," did you listen to that one?
Is it on Alter Ego, or because I'm
Yeah. It's the one where I talk about two of my relationships, and then I talk about kind of moving forward, and it's the one about the butterfly wings. Yeah, so you know that one. The third verse of that actually talks about my kind of entry into the nerdcore sphere and how I feel like I had finally found a place and people who felt like my people. And throughout my life, I've always, tried to find the thing that Chester was looking for in Linkin Park, somewhere I belong, right? And I've never really, I've never really found that just throughout my life. I've never had like a clique, a friend group that I was, consistently around in middle school or high school, that sort of thing. So throughout college, I was trying to find that. I thought I'd found it, but then it imploded on itself. And and then I was and then I found another kind of circle of people, and then I found nerdcore. And those first couple of years I feel were, as you said, really positive. And I, especially after I'd gone to South by for the first time and met everyone in person, I felt like it was kind of it felt like a home for me, like a community that I could belong to. And that has evolved, I would say. I think that my loyalty right now lies a lot more with my fans and with the friends that I've really made close to me through this process. But I have had a variety of different experiences with people who are involved within the nerdcore sphere. And sometimes I get the feeling that, maybe I was wrong in the real thing. Maybe I hadn't really found a true home, because I feel like there are a couple of people, and like granted, it's like really limited to only a couple of people. But sometimes I feel like there were people who felt rather hostile to me and who didn't feel like either I paid my dues or, didn't take my feelings seriously, and I felt very disappointed by that. I'm not gonna like mince words about it. I was really disappointed by the behavior of some people who were involved within the nerdcore sphere. And when that happens, like the only thing I can do is to like commit loyalty to the people who have been respectful to me and who have been my friends and have supported me throughout and like actually bother to listen to me and my opinions. And when I think about not necessarily thinking that Nerdcore was like my final home anymore, I don't mean the fans. Like, I think all the fans who listen to me and love me, like, yeah, they're passionate about it. And like, I will never kind of ditch my fans for anything. Like, regardless of what happens in my career, I will always remember, and I think my fans will attest to this as well. I'm good at remembering fans' names. Like, I remember their names, and they're always very happy to hear that. Fans are really important to me, and I'm really glad that I can make a positive impact in their life. As far as like a community, though, like I think that maybe I still have a ways to go because some people can't behave, and it's just kind of like an evolution of my perspective towards a certain group of people, and obviously the vast majority of people within their core are great people. But I think me, as far as my personality, I've always been a little bit more of a lone wolf, and I think at this point, maybe I should just come to terms with that, and I can only pledge fealty to the people who are willing to return that. So
I was so sure, for so long, I was so sure that we had mostly moved past that version of nerdcore hip-hop.
And apparently we haven't. For so long, I felt like people would just see my skills and see the amount of work I put in and just take that at face value. And no, I like apparently, the way I look and the way I sound like still matters, I was very disappointed. I was very disappointed because I've always operated on this thing of like I can kind of I've always believed that I could transcend sexism, and I can't.
I'm here as a cis hetero white male to tell you, unfortunately, we built a very powerful paradigm on that. Sexism and racism, we really, if there's anything white dudes gave to the world, it's dark. Anyway, we're gonna move to more like slightly more positive and kind of almost lighter fare. You mentioned that you performed at South by Southwest, and I've obviously had you on a couple shows up in this area, and you've gone on a few tours. Well, thank you for coming out and like doing it, because you being on the show makes it a better show. So you did your 3 tours and everything. I know you toured with Chris and Dualcore. Talk to us about just the general tour experience. Were they so? Remind me, what are the 3 like bigger tours that you've done?
Okay. So I did that thing with Dualcore and Chris, right? So that was late 2018, and that was 7 weeks. Last year I did a 3-week tour with Super Smack, and I headlined that tour. That was my first headlining tour, and that was also fall of 2019. And then right after, I got a call to do another tour with Chris and Schaefer. That was 5 weeks. So those are the 3 major tours that I've done. So the total amount of time that I spent on tour was 15 weeks within the last year and a half.
That's a lot of time, honestly, especially for an independent artist. So let's talk about touring. What is touring like for you, Lexicon? A lot of people still look back at touring in a very kind of like 90s back kind of way. People all pile into a bus or a van or like a large like traveler carry van, and they have these big tour shows. What is it like for you as an independent artist, as an internet outreach artist, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, how else are we gonna do it nowadays, right? The internet is our friend. What's touring like for me? For me, it's quite a compact endeavor. All the 3 times that I've toured, I've never been in a bus. I've never been in the tour van. The biggest car that I've been in was an SUV. So I've been in an SUV, I've been in an intermediate SUV, and I've been in a regular sedan. And so each of these times, I had one co-driver and co-tour person, because in general, MC Chris doesn't, share his van with his openers, and that's just I think it's just a practical thing, and it generally works out really well for all of us when he does that. So, yeah. But as far as traveling goes, all 3 of my tours I've done with a different artist, and usually an artist that I'm friends with. Usually an artist who does their own project, not a bandmate. They're performing their own project. I'm performing my own project. And so essentially, this has been 3 times of consecutive spending a bunch of time with one person. And the experience with each of these different tour mates was very different. And I would consider all 3 of them really close friends now because of these tour experiences. And I would say that's the major social aspect of being on tour for me, is spending a lot of time with one other person, listening to their music over and over, getting to know them really well, sharing some cool stories in the car, because there's so much stuff to talk about when you're in the front 2 seats of a car, hours and hours on end. And yeah, I would say that, save for the first tour where Dual Core didn't really trust me to drive, for good reason. I had just gotten my license then. The 2 other tours were also, opportunities for me to practice driving on highways. And I feel like I got a lot better and more confident at driving just through them, because I haven't been driving a car for very long. And I really only got a license so that I could go on tour. So those are... that's kind of what tour feels like for me on a social and technical level. As far as the shows, the shows are always hit or miss, and when you're headlining, it's a lot harder to bring people out compared to when you're touring under a headliner. So in that way, touring with Super Smack was really different from touring with Chris on both of the other tours, because I had more of a responsibility of bringing people out, and Super Smack did too. Essentially, we were kind of co-headliners. But as far as doing the shows goes, I would say that the biggest benefit of being on tour is to just be able to play every single night, for the most part. I really developed my vocal skills, and I really developed my, subconscious performance skills through consistently doing a show every single day. I think that level of drilling really, gets you leaps and bounds further from where you were before. And obviously, every night is an exercise in, in a job that's very social. As Schaefer would put it, every night we would walk into our office, basically. All right, it's time to make the donuts, is what he would say. We would go to our merch table, and it's a social thing. It's really social. I would say it's very pro-social. You have to be an extremely pro-social person to do it, because not only do you have to give all of your energy on stage, you have to come downstage immediately after and talk to people who have been listening to you for a really long time, in, Schaefer and Chris's case, and Dual Core's case. And, these are people, when you think about kind of the separation of the merch table between artist and fan, that's a really compelling separation. Because think about when you're a fan going to a really big artist who is somehow still not big enough that he doesn't do he or they don't do any meet and greets at all. So let's say you go to see an artist that you are a really big fan of, but they somehow still do a meet and greet at the merch table. Think about the different dynamic between those 2 people, and how you have to toe the line between being really pro-social and positive and making them feel validated and making them feel like they got something out of this experience. And you have to make sure that they keep their boundaries, because some people don't have those boundaries. And some people just love your stuff so much, and they're so invested in you, in their perception of you as a performer, that they may cross your boundaries. And for me, being on tour was a huge lesson in learning how to manage that and imagining myself on the other side of the table, how I would interact with a performer and how they would interact with me, and then just putting myself into the shoes of the performer. And that has really taught me a lesson, is when people pay to see you, when people pay tickets to see you, that's a different dynamic than when you walk next to them on the street and you you see someone. Like, I might see the exact same person on the street and in a concert hall where I'm behind the merch table and they're paying to see me. So that dynamic is really different, and you have to know how to manage that without seeming too unfriendly and without seeming overly friendly. And what I mean by that is, obviously, I am always extremely friendly and personable, but I can't reasonably make friends with my fans, very close friends with my fans. So I have to make them feel appreciated, and at the same time, make sure that nobody crosses a boundary. Especially for someone like me, I have to manage people who don't behave as well. Gosh, yeah, there have been. Not really like, yeah, there are some unwanted propositions. There's someone who gave me his phone number on a napkin and said, like, you're probably not gonna call me back, but I figured I would do this anyway. I just looked at him, I was like, yeah, I probably won't, but thanks anyway. there was someone who, there was a woman who, like, propositioned me, and, like, I'm not a fan of that, because, like, a lot of women think that it's okay to do that because they're women talking to a woman, but, like, I don't think that's okay, like, respect my boundaries, and that was pretty uncomfortable. I think, like, especially, like, some women are, like, more brazen. They're like, oh, like, I'm out here and I'm, like, I'm looking to fuck the hot thing in town, and I'm just like, dude, like, we're at work. Yeah.
Quick heads up to anyone watching this that goes to concerts or ever attends concerts or meets their artists at things that their artists have to, like, work at or be at. Not really usually the time to proposition them for a date, really, or anything. It's just not. If you really feel like for some reason you would deeply connect with that person, don't do it when they're, as you said, working. You're going into the office. You're trying to do your job. You have a bunch of social people to manage. You can't sit and flirt. It's not gonna happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing as, like, going up and propositioning, like, a barista, right? Like, that's a social job, and, like, that's not appropriate. And I think that people kind of lose sense of that when they're at a show, because sometimes they're just so starstruck, and they just want to talk to you and talk to you all about their problems, and, I can't give them the time of day. So, but what I mean by that is, like, I can't give them the appropriate amount of time that would be, that they would need to, like, process their emotional issues, but I can express my appreciation for how much, my music means to them, and thank them for coming, and, try to relate to them on a personal level, but I cannot make deep friendships while in this context.
So, talking about fan-artist meeting, we'll jump over to, you mention being the fan, kind of projecting yourself as, if I'm the fan meeting an artist, what would that be like? and then how would I respond, kind of thing. Let's talk about your influences, because musically you're very broad, I think, as a performer. I think cerebral pop rapper is a great identifier that doesn't exclude anything that you might include. So that's a phenomenal label. So who do you think informs you artistically? The people, the artists you listen to that are definitely root, like almost infrastructure or foundational to sort of what you do.
Infrastructure wise, I would say early Eminem is like baked into my brain, because that's what I listened to when I was 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. And apparently it's been scientifically shown that the kind of music you listen to at that time is the kind of music that will continue to activate dopamine receptors throughout your life. So yeah, and so I enjoy listening to that kind of like very intense, very complex, very sometimes very fast and very emotional rap.
So Eminem.
Yeah, so specifically early Eminem. So like late 90s, early 2000s. I would say like the Eminem Show is like a really impactful, influential album on my style. Just like very emotionally raw and lyrically complex. And I feel like a lot of his cadences and deliveries and rhyme scheme patterns were very much baked into my brain way before I decided to write original stuff. And so by the time I started to write original stuff, I saw all of those influences from my like preteen times like floating up to the surface again. I was like, whoa, like this stuff never really went away, did it? Obviously, like I don't condone a lot of like the more like less PC stuff that he does, I don't like the homophobic stuff or any of that. But I think it would be remiss to, deny that he was like a wordsmith, and his wordsmithery really influenced me growing up. So there's that. More modern influence would probably be Watsky, as far as, a kind of more poetic and, kind of a more poetic, approach to writing lyrics. And I think he's also very nerdy and very quirky and very different. And recently he's taken on more of a psychedelic lens to the music as well. So yeah, I feel like his album Times Infinity was a very strong influence on Alter Ego, where there are a lot of different sounds, but kind of like a unifying concept of coming to terms with your own insignificance. And that is something that I also explore in Alter Ego, coming to terms with my own insignificance and the changing of my ego while going through some, really hard times. And overall, I think Watsky and his very individual, take no bullshit, I'm gonna do my own thing style and his fast rap and cadences and rhyme structures have been a strong modern influence on the way I write rap lyrics. So as far as lyrical composition, I think those two artists are pretty heavy. Music wise, I'm really all over the place. I recently met the Gregory brothers, who run Shmoyoho, the channel, and they make obviously meme songs, Auto-Tune the News and Songify and all that stuff, like Double Rainbow, that sort of thing. But they also make very original pop tunes, and I think I listened to a lot of those earlier tunes that they made on their channel back when I was a teenager, and I got to kind of also ingrain that pop sensibility in my head as well. I would say that they what they make is one of many influences of all of the different internet based artists that I've listened to throughout my teens. And yeah, it's gonna be really hard to nail down just one musical influence, but I listen to so many bands, and I would say that things that I generally like are heavy music and pop structured music. Heavy, pop structured, emotional. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like Avenged Sevenfold, like that's like pop metal, right? That's like very heavy pop metal, and they were my favorite band in high school. So I've seen them twice live, and I will see them again. Yeah. So this is it's that sort of thing, and it isn't just heavy metal and rock and roll, but also electronic, as well. It's hard to nail down just one thing, but if there were things that influenced me, you can bet that they're probably heavy, melodic, and poppy.
Now that you're coming into your second album, and I know obviously, now that you're coming into your second full-length album, and I should be clear about that. If you go to your website, there's a number of other EPs, singles. There's that collaborative album that you released where you're like, this is me rapping with other people, which was really good. That's a really nice thing to have on a Bandcamp so that I don't have to hunt those tracks down. But now that you're on to your second album, do you feel like you're gonna approach this differently? Again, you've done South by twice, 3 times, 2 times, 6 times.
I have done it twice, and I'm gonna do it again this year.
Doing it again this year?
Yeah.
So with this new album, been 3.5, 4 years and everything, as far as this, are you planning to promote this or work this album as you have in the past, like, 1.5 years or so? You're going on tour, you may be headlining a tour or something like that?
I'm not gonna headline a tour anytime soon, probably because it really is a lot of work. I think considering the last headlining tour that I did, I realized that it's very challenging, and I may not be in the best, position to do that still at the moment. Like, I did it last time, I think it went well, but I feel like I may need some more time to grow so that I could do it better. So what I am planning to do is, obviously, like, touring is being made hard right now because of the virus epidemic, and I am concerned about, hosting events and being at events and traveling, and I'm concerned that, people might find it too much of a risk to attend events, so I'm going to hold off on touring at least for the next couple of months. But I do want to tour later in the year. I think it's a little unfortunate that, the virus is hitting right now, makes it kind of hard for me to do my job at the moment. But hopefully it should clear up a little bit, fingers crossed, by later this year. And then I can go on tour, and I think it would be great if I could go on tour with, someone who can be more of a headliner, or we can co-headline, something like that.
But do you think that there's, like, fiscal value?
Oh, absolutely. It is the main way I make money is by touring, is by hitting the road and selling stuff. That is the main way I make money. And that's why it's concerning that I can't do it as much, especially like around the eve of my album release. I can't go on tour is a concerning thing to me because this is around the time that I would get the most momentum.
Yeah.
However, I also feel like maybe the Nerdcore thing doesn't really work like that much, and like people are willing to see you on tour, basically whatever. It doesn't matter.
We're very excited to see you anytime you schlep out to the West Coast.
I mean, I know, like, I had a tour planned for the West Coast in April, and I was gonna go to Seattle. Now I don't want to go, so I don't think I will. I think I'm gonna pull the plug on it before I even announce it because it's just not. It doesn't feel right. But like going back to going back to what you're saying, I think this is really putting a damper on events because people are afraid to come out. But as far as do I think this is a fiscally right, important thing for me to do? Absolutely. Like, it is a major income source, and I would really like the opportunity to tour in the rest of the year. I just don't know who with. Like, I think it's always an opportunity that comes along. I never really ask people if they want to go on tour, except Super Smack, but that was more like a co-headlining thing. But usually I wait for like an opportunity to come through where I get an offer, and that's never guaranteed, and I never know what's gonna happen. So I guess I'm just gonna have to wait and see how this develops and see if people are touring. And the other thing is that I think there's a limited pool of people that I can be touring with right now, and one of my goals is to expand that pool. And if possible, I would love to be on tour with someone who isn't necessarily within this niche. And I don't know how I can make it happen, but I think that the obviously the possibility is out there, and it's possible to do it. And I think the way for me to get there is have a lot of traction on the internet and find a way for me to be placed into something that has like a bigger mainstream exposure kind of deal. Like, for example, if I write a song that gets placed in a TV show or it gets placed in an advertisement, that's immediate bunch of ears on it who would have never heard it otherwise, right? Like, I saw someone tour with Watsky who wrote a song that appeared in Into the Spider-Verse, and that's how he got the tour, right? Like, people were like, oh, this person, like, never heard of this person, but he wrote a song that was in Into the Spider-Verse. So, I mean, I don't know how that deal actually worked out, but I do know that it was because he had, that placement that people...
And that is something that I hope that I could get.
Just call up every, comic book and like indie film studio, and just be like, just put my songs in. They're emotionally appropriate for the material, so put them in. To wrap.
I want to make stuff that is, sounds appropriate to be in a movie.
Yeah. You definitely do.
A movie or a TV show or whatever.
Yeah.
I know people who have had songs placed in TV shows. It's not impossible.
Yep.
So I think that could be a viable next step for me. As far as like growing my career, as far as maintaining my career and making money off of it, like touring is still king, right? Like, this is how we make money.
Yep.
And you have to work really hard for it, but this is what you do now. And it is a grind, and it is not easy money. But for me, it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy being on the road, so I would like to do it as often as possible when there is not an epidemic.
If you want to find out if Lex the Lexicon artist is destined to be an artist for the rest of their life, or if they are instead going to give up and just join some startup company and become a working peon like the rest of us, become like a social media interface executive, or something, you should go get Alter Ego. You can pre-order it now. You can order it on Bandcamp, iTunes, possibly Google Play. Just look for it, or you can also, of course, sign up for any kind of like notifications through any of these services. But yeah, get it. It's a great album. You can currently listen to Party Hop, and I can't remember the title of the song you just dropped today. I know. Yeah, you can currently listen to Party Hop and I Know. March 31st, the whole thing will come out. And then you can go back and listen to the rest of her catalog if you've not heard Lex the Lexicon artist. So go to those social media platforms. You can also get an update on how the album is, or at least my thoughts on the album, in Nerd Music and Judgment. Episode 3 will be about Alter Ego. That will come out before March 31st, before the album. I'd like to thank Lex for joining us here at Dying of Exposure.